If you're intrigued by a tale of vengeance, unlikely protectors, and a bond born from necessity, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with us as the story unfolds. You won't want to miss what happens next. Evelyn Carlisle's life had been nothing more than a perfectly orchestrated performance until that fateful night. A single mistake, an impulsive decision, and suddenly, the whispers of scandal began to crawl through the walls of her family's grand estate. She had always known that her father's expectations weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she had never truly felt the extent of his control until he handed her over to Ryden Cole, a ruthless bounty hunter with a reputation so dark that even the stars seemed to shy away from it. It was a punishment, he said, a consequence for the embarrassment she had caused, for her recklessness in a world that valued appearances above all else. Evelyn stood there, heart racing, as the man who had become both her captor and her protector, a stranger whose cold eyes mirrored the emptiness of his soul, stared at her with an unsettling calm. He wasn't here for her. He wasn't here to make her life easier. He was here to teach her a lesson, and he wouldn't be gentle about it. The first days with him were nothing short of hell. She'd imagined what it would be like to be under the watchful eye of a man like him, someone who lived in the shadows and dealt in violence. But the reality was far worse than she could have ever dreamed. Ryden didn't speak much. His presence was like a storm in the distance, a quiet warning that if you didn't keep your distance, it would tear you apart without hesitation. Her father had made it clear. He wanted her humbled, and he'd found the perfect man to ensure it. Evelyn's defiance burned bright within her, and yet, as she saw the way Ryden moved with a purpose that seemed almost protective, something unexpected began to stir inside her. She was no fool. This wasn't a tale of romance. Not yet. But she couldn't deny the strange pull that tied her to him. The way his eyes, though cold, seemed to understand something she hadn't dared face herself. His silent protection, though brutal, began to feel like the only thing standing between her and the chaos her life had become. Evelyn couldn't escape. She wouldn't be allowed to. And as the days passed, she began to realize that she might not want to. Would Ryden Cole, the man she feared, become the one person who could save her from the scandal that threatened to consume everything she knew? Or was he simply another part of the darkness she couldn't outrun? The answer, Evelyn knew, was yet to come. But the winds were shifting, and something about this man, this protector, felt like the start of something neither of them could have predicted. The days blurred into weeks, each one a new lesson in survival. Evelyn's defiance had been smothered by the harsh, unyielding nature of Ryden Cole, but in the stillness of their shared silence, something else had taken root, something she hadn't expected. Her father had thrown her to the wolves, but Ryden had proven to be far more than just the beast she'd imagined. Beneath his ice-cold exterior and unflinching control, there was a quiet intensity, a silent promise to protect her from everything and everyone, even if it meant staining his own hands with blood. She couldn't deny the pull, the odd comfort that came from his presence, though it sickened her to admit it. There were moments when, in the quiet of their campfires, she saw something behind those steel-gray eyes, something more human than she'd ever thought possible. Ryden never spoke of his past, but the weight of it hung around him like a cloud. Evelyn had learned to tread carefully, not daring to ask about the things that haunted him, the things he tried so desperately to bury. It was clear from the way he moved, with precision and purpose, that his life had been forged in violence, and that violence was his currency. Yet, there was something else about him that set him apart from the other men she had known, something that spoke of honor, a code that he followed, even if it was buried deep beneath his stoic exterior. It was there in the way he protected her from the harshest elements of the wilderness, in the way he had saved her life without hesitation when a band of outlaws had targeted them. In that moment, with his gun drawn and his body shielding hers, Evelyn realized that Ryden Cole, though ruthless, was a man of unexpected loyalty. But that loyalty came at a price. As their days together wore on, Evelyn found herself questioning the very foundation of her existence. What had she been before this? A pampered daughter of a man who believed power was the ultimate currency? Or was she something more, someone who could stand on her own, even in the face of overwhelming odds? Ryden didn't care for her father's power or his wealth, and that was what made him different from the men who had always surrounded her. He was a man of action, not words, and that made her feel both vulnerable and oddly safe. The more she learned about him, the more she realized that Ryden wasn't just her captor, nor was he the heartless mercenary her father had described. He was a man shaped by pain, a man who had been forced into a world where survival came before anything else. She could see it in the weariness that lingered in his eyes, and the way his posture seemed to collapse when he thought she wasn't looking. He wasn't just protecting her from the world outside, but from himself, from the parts of him that he kept buried beneath layers of brutality. And though Evelyn had been thrust into this strange existence against her will, she began to understand that this was no longer about punishment. It was about survival. They made an odd pair, an aristocratic daughter and a feared bounty hunter, bound by nothing but circumstance. And yet, in the middle of the wilderness, amidst the endless stretches of unrelenting terrain, something began to shift between them. It wasn't love, at least, not yet, but it was something else. Trust. It was something that had been broken in Evelyn long ago, when her father had betrayed her with his cold judgment. But Ryden had built it, piece by piece, by keeping her alive, by standing between her and the chaos she had never asked for. It was in the quiet moments when she found herself seeking his company, when she realized she didn't mind the silence that hung between them. She had grown to appreciate his stillness, the way he didn't demand anything from her. Ryden didn't ask for her approval or her affection. He simply existed beside her, a constant presence that was both intimidating and oddly comforting. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn found herself questioning everything: her upbringing, her father's cold expectations, and even the future that had seemed so certain before this journey began. One night, as they sat beneath a blanket of stars, Evelyn couldn't hold back the question that had been plaguing her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, afraid to break the fragile truce between them. Ryden didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the fire, the flames flickering in his eyes, and Evelyn could have sworn she saw something. Pain, regret, something darker lurking just beneath the surface. But then, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I don't know your father anything, but I've been hired to keep you alive, and that's what I'm going to do." The simplicity of his words struck her harder than any of the harsh judgments her father had ever passed on her. She had expected more, some grand justification, some explanation that would make sense of the twisted path she now walked. But Ryden didn't believe in explanations, and that was what made him so different from everyone she had ever known. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. And so, she stayed, bound by the strange, undeniable force that kept her from walking away. Evelyn couldn't quite name what it was, but the longer she stayed with Ryden, the more she realized that her father's punishment had unwittingly forged a bond that neither of them could escape. In the heat of danger, in the stillness of the nights they spent together, a new understanding was born between them, a bond that no longer felt like punishment, but like something far more complex. Would it ever turn into something more? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: Ryden Cole, the man her father had thrown her to, had become her protector in ways that no one else could ever be. The world had shifted beneath Evelyn's feet, and with it, so had the bond between her and Ryden Cole. What began as a forced, cold arrangement had evolved into something far more dangerous and far more intimate than either of them had anticipated. The quiet moments they shared by the fire, the unexpected tenderness in his rare smiles, and the fierce protectiveness that grew in him as he guarded her. All of it began to blur the lines between captor and protector, between necessity and something deeper. Evelyn couldn't lie to herself anymore. There was something inside her that had begun to depend on Ryden, something that, even in the face of the violence and danger he brought with him, felt oddly comforting. But in the world they inhabited, where danger lurked in every shadow and betrayal could be bought with a mere whisper, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Ryden's past was never far behind them, and Evelyn soon learned that the men who had made their lives a living hell were closing in. As the days grew colder and their small camp grew quieter, the tension between them was palpable. It was clear now, more than ever, that Evelyn's survival was tied to Ryden's, and his survival was tied to hers. But the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Their enemies were no longer just distant threats. They were closing in, hunting them down with an unrelenting fury. The first sign came when a stranger appeared on the edge of their camp, a man with the rough look of someone who had seen too many things in the world of bounty hunting. He didn't say much, but the message in his eyes was enough. Ryden had always been a man who moved like a shadow, never seen until he wanted to be, and yet, even he couldn't avoid the inevitable. A price had been put on his head, a bounty on the man who had long been a ghost in the world of the living. The news was as clear as it was dangerous. The enemies that had haunted Ryden for years, the men who had long since sworn to bring him to justice, had finally found him. Evelyn couldn't believe it at first. The idea that Ryden, the man who had protected her with his life, had a history dark enough to warrant such hatred, seemed impossible. But as she watched him prepare for what was coming, saw the look in his eyes that spoke of inevitable war, she understood that their time was running out. The love she had once denied herself, the strange connection she had come to depend on, was now the very thing that could get them both killed. The world they had built between them, born from necessity, would not be enough to save them when the storm finally hit. That storm came sooner than expected. Ryden had always been 2 steps ahead, a master of survival. But even he couldn't anticipate the betrayal that lay at the heart of their torment. The night they had been preparing to leave the camp, to escape the approaching threat, Ryden was blindsided by a gunshot. A bullet aimed directly at him, fired by someone Evelyn had trusted. The realization struck her like a thunderclap. The person who had been feeding information to their enemies was someone she had once seen as an ally. The weight of the betrayal settled over her like a heavy cloak, suffocating and cold. Ryden barely managed to survive the attack, his body riddled with wounds that bled as if he were a mere mortal, but his spirit remained unbroken. As they fled to the only sanctuary they had left, a hidden cabin on the outskirts of the wilderness, Evelyn found herself at a crossroads. The man she had come to rely on, the man who had been her protector in ways she had never imagined, was now the one who needed her protection. But her own strength, her own courage, felt small in comparison to the challenge before them. She had never known the depth of her feelings for him until she saw him vulnerable, until she realized that, in the end, he had become more than a protector. He had become her reason to fight. The cabin, once a safe haven, had turned into a prison. They were trapped, with enemies on all sides, the land as unforgiving as the men who hunted them. As Ryden's wounds slowly began to heal, the plan for their final confrontation took shape. This would not be a battle for survival alone. It would be the reckoning for all that had come before. Evelyn had no illusions about what they were facing. The final showdown was coming, and it would either break them or forge something unbreakable between them. Ryden, though weak, had a look in his eyes that Evelyn had never seen before, a determination so fierce that it seemed to burn through the very air around them. He was ready to fight, ready to face his past head-on, no matter the cost. And though Evelyn had once been a mere spectator to this world of violence and betrayal, she was no longer that woman. She had learned from him, and now she would fight alongside him. The man who had once been her captor had become her partner, and she would stand by his side, come what may. As the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape, Evelyn knew that everything had changed. The woman who had been handed over to a ruthless bounty hunter was no longer just the victim of her father's cruel decisions. She was no longer a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She was a force in her own right, a woman who had found not just love, but strength in the most unlikely of places. The final reckoning was upon them, and in the quiet moments before the storm hit, Evelyn took Ryden's hand in hers. This was it, the moment that would define their fate, the moment where they would face their enemies together. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn was no longer afraid.